So I'm really fascinated by all the 5 presentations, and I also find, although I guess maybe you don't know each other previously, but I think these there are several key words I think that appear again and again in all the talks. I think the first term is ghost. It's interesting because I'm thinking about in Chinese we have for ghost this character or this term gui. But we have, I mean, if we talk about gui, we mean, if we translate gui into English, it could be ghost, but it could also be monster. It could also be demon. You know, you have various kind of English translations that you can use. And of course, for example, in the Sino-Japanese War, we also call Japanese the monsters, or yeah. And also in Hong Kong today, still, we call white people ghost or monster. You know, you have all these kind of still living ghosts or use of terms, yeah, today. And I think in all speakers' presentations, ghosts also this haunting, you know, theme. But I think in different contexts, they also mean different things. So I think maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. And also, at certain points, I also think about, of course, because we talk about, you know, Zomia and anarchism, you know, maybe we are thinking through curation or art projects, the possibility to, you know, be against this grand narrative of the nation, or but maybe nation or nationalism even is still also a form of ghost that is haunting us. I think ghost also related to the idea of uncanny, as Yongwoo also mentioned. Yeah, I will go back to the idea of uncanny later. Okay, the second term that I found also was repeated was shaman, actually, shamanism, okay? And shamanism in relation to maybe its ritual. And the ritual is also very much related to body. The bodily dialogue, and maybe also a kind of a legend or myth. With Shen Xin also lastly talk about the dialogue. I mean, maybe shaman as a medium between different words and make different kind of conversations, just interlocutors, right? So, but also singing as a kind of conversation between different, I mean, classes or, you know, different words again, okay. How do you think about this kind of ritual through various kinds of, you know, bodily, acoustic, or other kinds of, you know, ritual, or maybe they're creating, you know, in-between spaces through all these things, okay. And the last one is, I think, the idea of nomad. And nomad in relation with anarchism or Zomia idea, Zomia land, or this anti-settlement, or this kind of, again, you know, very fluid and a very multi, you know, possibility of calling for or you know, define home. And then I want to address again this issue of uncanny, because if we, in German, uncanny is unheimlich, right? So it is related to Heim, which means home. So it's something that you feel home, but not, you know, there's a certain kind of both unfamiliarity and familiarity in this uncanny, so that you feel a bit scared about that. So, I mean, and I think it also related to nostalgia. If we talk about home, I mean, nostalgia is also related to this idea of longing for a home which might not really exist. It might only be in your imaginary or you know, it's a kind of invention of yourself. But this home could be, what I see in Zhang Ling's research, a kind of ethnic minority. I mean, even though, I mean, even the songs were sung in Mandarin, it's not in their like local language, and how it's also kind of tried to, you know, call for a kind of nostalgia even among diasporic Chinese communities, you know. But it could also be many other things. I mean, a home that is maybe even absent in many ways. So yeah, I mean, ghost shamanism, or you know, this kind of interlocutors, and also this unsettled status of people, of thoughts, of imaginary and real land or home, you know, this nomadic situation. These are things that I see really interconnect all these talks, and really, I think they're addressing urgent and really important questions we're all looking at it today. So I would just maybe let our speakers to maybe go on to maybe, I don't know, say something more about these three ideas, or you can also maybe make comments on the rest of the speakers if you want. Yeah. Yeah, maybe. Well, yeah.
Sorry, I still like having a heavy jet lag, and I'm trying to accumulating my thoughts and ideas more precisely in here, but like I apologize in advance. So I utilized the concept of the spectrography from Derrida and Bernard Stiegler in relation to the process of the traces of the ghostly conversations mediated through the technologies that is actually closely related to the concept of the archive and the absence of the archive itself, which is still stigmatized among the researchers, among the post-colonial subjectivities, like heavily influenced by the approach, or like the possibility of approach to these specific archives, as well as some of the possibility of alterability issues. So going back to the discourses on the ghosts and phantoms and apparitions and the shamanisms, I always trying to think about the historical specificity in South Korea after the liberation period. And that was the moment of what Gramscian notions of interregnum, which is like everything has to be live, and everything is not alive nor dead. So it's like in the middle of nowhere, and that's the essence of in-betweenness, and where these spirits of apparitions and the interstitial voices can be heard. So I think that these issues of the archive and how I can like unboxing these issues that has been never been included within the official history of Korea and Asian context. And within my curatorial projects, I try to discover and unearthing these voices and spirits and ghost voices that can freely talk about. Like, when we actually talk about like the post-colonial theories, and we always like quoting the Gayatri Spivak's very famous quotations, can subalterns speak? And I always thinking about like, can subaltern can sing in this Diva context, right? And in all of this is actually closely related to the constructions of the knowledge systems. And I'd like to address that like in relation to our previous conversation yesterday, that we talked about what's the notions of modernism, modernity, cosmopolitanisms, and internationalism, and so forth. And all is like postisms and the theories of isms is actually for me, as a local scholars who has the pre-colonial experiences inherited, I always confronted these problematic constructions of the knowledge systems whenever I think about, for example, like yesterday, Mia talking about East versus West and what it means to be Orientalisms and so forth, right? And then the Naoki Sakai from Cornell University, he always trying to confronting the notions and ideas of why the Asian context is always kind of categorized by the Western perspectives as within the categories of anthropos, for example, versus the humanitas, right? And all of the Western ideologies and a Western-centric idea has been always included in the categorizations of the humanity, while Asian context and Asian majority has to seek their own historical specificity in relation to Western-centric majority formations, right? So in here, I'd like to interrogate the notions and ideas of constructions of knowledge system is basically embedded within us as post-colonial subjectivities and the problematic archival approachness. So we have to think about all kind of like situated knowledges and try to practice these specific colonial sources and like whenever I'm talking about the apparisms and ghosts, the archive and the absence of archive is always linked to the system of knowledge, as well as what it means to be colonial modernity, because we don't have any archives about the colonial modernity that has been destroyed during the consecutive wars. And where can we actually find these evidences and the testimony of this unheard historiography that we have to consistently stick to, right? So, and we also have to think about what counts as knowledge and who has the power to approach us to these specific knowledges. So these are all kind of making a hermeneutical process of how we actually trying to define this Derridian ontology of the knowledge systems. And these are also the recurring question to me in relation to the Asian Diva exhibitions that I'd like to focus on, that these voices has never been discovered in official history, and these voices itself were actually the ghost trying to make ourselves to be modern more and so forth. So I'd like to toss in.
Yeah, thank you. Because I do research on sound and voice and music, I think we all of our papers somehow deal with human voice, singing, speaking, and environmental sounds, and music, especially folk music. So it's very interesting when you talk about during the war, Vietnam War, American soldiers carry a speaker, and also the Cold War situations, and you also talk about communists took refuge in the forest. Yeah, especially Malaysian Communist Party, Magong, there were famous stories, and also popularized by Malaysian Taiwanese writer Huang Jinshu in a few novels. And yeah, so this, because forest also provided camouflage, the hidden haven for these communists. And later, most of them got killed or eradicated. So then decades later, they came out to kind of surrendered to the government. And so this also, you talk about songs mediation or remediation by technology through gramophone, but also radio. When we talk about radio voice, we consider disembodied voice. So it's ghostly voice in gramophone and radio. And so in terms of Magong, Malaysian Communist Party, they retreated to their radio station to Hunan, in a mountain among forest. They broadcasted to Southeast Asian countries in multiple languages, including Malay and and Mandarin, Russian, and English, and other languages. Yeah, so it's very interesting to think about environmental sounds, ecological revolution, in relation to revolution, and radio and gramophone. Yeah, so that's environmental sounds. And so when we talk about disembodied voice, besides radio, I think in Shen Xin's video is very interesting. Also, disembodied voice. We don't see the narrator. At least in the clips, we didn't see the narrator, the woman narrator, the woman speaking Chinese. Yeah, so this also kind of spectral voice, and also there's a voice overlapping. One embodied voice and one disembodied voice. So this coexistence of multiple voices. And another thing I want to see is the sound of breathing. Yeah, in the end of your video, we hear the breathing. Maybe the cameraman is you. Yeah. So a strong sense of embodiment, but without seeing the person, but a strong sense of a presence of the witness, of the cameraman with the camera. So very interesting to think about voice in relation to human body and to environment, of course, to animals and plants and other species. And another thing I want to respond to your question is about the, not only nation state as goals, but also socialist goals in China, because nowadays, if you have been to China, it's already turned into a capitalist society. And so the socialist heritage, almost the past tense. So nowadays, when we watch these socialist films, the message might be too straightforward or too clear-cut. So it's worth resituating these films in the contemporary social context, and also in the transnational context, as you mentioned, uncanny in relation to homeland. So as I talked to Emily, the Sister Liu's reception in Southeast Asia was quite depoliticized, because people consider it a beautiful film, the singing, the people, the landscape. And they especially praised and longed for the landscape. So as a kind of metaphor of homeland and timeless, a kind of ancient landscape, and not dealing with the contemporary political struggle between the two governments. I guess I will stop here. Maybe other people want to respond.
Maybe my turn, yeah. I consider all of these notions that we are all discussing in a very connected way is all within a process, they're all within a process of healing. Because I do believe that we are, as Gramsci and also and afterwards Bauman so rightfully saying, that this time of the monsters, that all the fatal moralities that we are seeing coming almost like on top of the water, that's almost impossible to escape from. Yet, for this reason, we need to go to the roots. We need to go to the ancestral. We need to go to the inaudible. We need to go to the invisible, those things that were haunted by Western epistemologies in the first place, that they were always categorized outside of that high intellectual vision, and those people who believed in them were considered primitive. And yet right now, we all need that primitive, so-called primitive knowledge and experience to be able to heal ourselves and heal our divisions, I would say. Because at the end of the day, by claiming back the roots, we reappropriating these methodologies or notions differently. We are also, we would like to erase, I would say we, like working on these issues and like, and considering them as a way out, to really erase the boundaries that are kind of put between us by the capitalist system, operated through war and machinery and death, that divided nations and divided communities. And now actually I think we are discovering that lots of other things are connecting us, and it's actually, thankfully it's happening through these artistic practices, because I think art actually is bringing that space along to be able to bring that invisible back into its power again.
Well, sorry, I just want to respond quickly to the idea of healing, because if we think about the origin of curation or curatorial, it's cure. Actually, it means to heal. Yeah. So to be a curator, so several of us also talk about curation. So to be a curator means also to heal the sick artworks from the archive. And so making an exhibition a kind of hospital, but and this is this is just what I want.
I think artworks are not sick. It's mostly our discourses that are sick.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that are sick, so we need curators to do something. Okay, yeah, please.
Within that, for me, I much prefer to imagine a non-human alignment for the positions that we're occupying, both sort of in a racialized sense in terms of a sexual minority sense, and in terms of a lot of these positions that we're occupying bring us closer to sort of the source of healing that we were talking about. But at the same time, although it seems a bit strange to be talking about healing at a time when these wounds are being dug deeper and deeper every single day. Where does that relationship come in?
Well, I think, these things generally happen at the same time, no? I mean, they are actually, like, these processes cannot be, from my personal point of view, you cannot really separate them. So it's the time of monsters that you can heal, actually. So we need to go that dark and that deep to be able to actually recognize and look for different ways, maybe unexpected ways, to sort it out ourselves, to bring it back, to take matters to the hand.
Yeah. So sorry. One additional thing that I want to respond to you, which I totally get where you're coming from, but I want to, I think, sort of reiterate this, because I think there's been a lot of this horrible discussion in contemporary art about, the indigenous will save the world.
Oh, yes.
And will heal us all, if only. Yeah, we were just talking about this. And it makes me want to barf in someone's face. Some white person's face, usually. Yes. But, I think it's very important in these contexts to reiterate that is absolutely not what we're talking about. And I think that, for example, for us, we look a lot, for instance, at Abhijan Toto, who allows us a perspective into ways of thinking with indigenous knowledge, which are thinking with history, which are thinking with these narratives, which are thinking with these wounds, but are imagining them in a completely different register. A lot of the time we were talking about the indigenous as sort of an ahistorical thing that we can go back to, but rather we have to understand.
No, it's a contemporary, it's not something to go back to.
Exactly. It's multiple contemporaries that are going to continue to occur. And I think I just wanted to clarify that.
No, of course. I think this is a very important point, an important discussion, because I also feel that a lot of discussion of the indigenous and the primitive right now, it's kind of used to cleanse guilt. Yeah. So it's different, actually, to it kind of requires another sort of, I would say, sincerity was a term that we were also like kind of talking about, in terms of this relationship between the micro and macro power constructions. Because on the one hand, there are certain, of course, institutions and like curators or like kind of, let's say, larger, like powerful structures using, let's say, the term indigenous, like, or show it, but at the same time, that the kind of deconstruction that all these indigenous positions suggest, and claiming back the roots and like kind of living in a sort of, living in the presence of the earth and air and water and light at the same time, it's not really happening in the power structure. So it's like, it's always speaking about the larger perspective, but when it comes actually the power constructions that are happening in the art world, it doesn't function. So of course, like, it becomes like a patch. You know, it's like a kind of a guilt cleansing. At the end of the day, of course, we need to think what actually those works say for the power constructions that we are in, and how we can disentangle ourselves like from that. So it's not only about using a concept over and over again, repeating it over and over again, or you know, using artworks to actually to appear politically correct, let's say. No, it's like how many black artists, how many queer artists, how many indigenous artists. No, we need to really also be really self-critical in that sense as curators, I would say.
I just talked a lot, so I just add something maybe that I was missing in terms of explaining about the discourse of the discourses are sick and the discourse of complicity, which when I started as an art student in London, it was something that, you know, you couldn't really escape of rendering yourself guilty in a discourse, rendering yourself complicit in the system, and in like as a result being validated as an artist, your labor and your intellectual investment and effort. And for me, I think this idea of works made through myself and this effort of creating a ghost is really to move away from that. There's a lot of refusal in not participating in many things, in many ways of thinking, and not because it's not really an active refusal either. It's just, it's not necessary, and it's completely unable, and a lot of people are able to undermine it. If you're talking about resources and materials and that are dominant, just look at the not dominant ones and seek whatever that's interesting. And I guess the ghost in my practices or the works that are made are of a very modest position, and the how modest it is because it cares, I guess. It's like it's a space, and suppose when the ghost is active or absent, or you can feel its absence or presence, in a sense, we are all cared for in that space of participating in something that's unknown, and there are bits that are known, and there are bits that are unknown, but the ghosts activate that space collectively and address and being addressed, in a communal participation.
Okay, I think the audience might also have something to ask our 5 speakers or comments. Please, yes.
Yeah, so I have 2 questions responding to Abhijan's, but also hopefully like other people can speak to it too. So I'm sure you get the question a lot, right, dealing with like non-state, like sort of I don't want to say romanticization, but like a positive, like you're valuing the non-state, right? So how do you do that without falling into a neoliberal kind of anti-state system? So that's my question. And then you brought up the Oh, right, yeah, because a lot of the principles of the neoliberal project are all about deconstructing the state and creating like a free market enterprise, right? And you know, individuals creating their own institutions as opposed to like existing within the previously, you know, situated one. So like, yeah, so, and I'm sure you have a solution. I want to hear what it is. And then you said, you know, we're still living in the Cold War. You said the Cold War is not over, and that I want to respond to have other people respond to that point, because I think in all these cases, like the suppressed voices that many of you are talking about, whether it's like the socialist song films or these like women's experiences of American colonization in Korea and in Vietnam, right? These are suppressed voices that are suppressed actually because we're still in the Cold War. And so I just wanted to, and same with you, you said like it's the right-wing people back then who are now in power in Turkey, right? So in what ways are you speaking to this point?
I wanted to, second, no, I have it. We have lots of mics, like it's like, this is so many mics. Just to maybe kind of create a digression, I would really like to, also as a kind of response to the forest, and the forest position, I would like to highlight, for example, the Kurdish feminist autonomous movement. And there is a kind of a very interesting and strong ecological discourse that they are coming from and that they are building actually in the parameters of war. And it's interesting, like it's kind of reminded me because going to in Turkish, for example, they say going up to the mountains. So going up to the mountains meant actually joining these forces, guerrilla on the mountains, fighting against Turkish state. And there are a lot of Kurdish youth that did it and still continue to do it. And this new movement, on the other hand, it's actually claiming to create municipal confederalism. This is like late anarchist Murray Bookchin, who actually proposes a new form of governance, of course, based on owning the resources, in the form of a cooperative, and like a kind of bypassing the state structure. So actually there is a non-state solution that exists, let's say, in these alternative discourses. And also the feminists, let's say the Kurdish feminists, they also call themselves, they call their discourse genealogy, the science of women. They kind of contribute a lot, actually, to this by claiming back the resources and gaining a living completely from, like, let's say, sowing the field, getting the crops, and trying to create a living outside the control of the Syrian state mechanisms. So just as a digression, I think it's an interesting answer to your question.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm just briefly going to respond to your questions in relation to the continuance of the Cold War epistemologies in Asia. I would like to say that, like, whether it is Cold War or not, I think I specifically want to look at the continuance of the the process of continual coloniality is still like ongoing in the consciousness of Koreans. Especially when we think about the Japanese imperialism from 1910 to 45, and during the 1920s to 30s, there was a kind of like Japanese intellectual discourses in relation to eugenics and superiority that has been embedded upon the consciousness of the Koreans and other territories such as Taiwan and southern archipelagos. And these kind of idea of racial and ethnic differences in relation to the ability in relation to the superiority complex where inferiority complex has been inherited to the post-colonial subjectivities. And when we're thinking about the power structures in relation to the formations of the knowledge systems, the majority of the intellectuals that has been very much propagate a lot of theories and ideas after the post-liberation period, their first language is a mother tongue is Japanese, not Korean. So this is also lingering to what we actually can relate it to the Shen's ideas and kind of like Bakhtin's notions of the heteroglossia. And there is a kind of like collisions and conflict in between the heteronormative kind of powerful agencies of who can actually talk and who cannot be, who should be silenced and so forth. And so I'd like to focus on whether it is a Cold War presence until in the contemporary Asia, whether I think it would be more interesting questions that we actually can think about that the continuance of the colonialities until now. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and I wouldn't say that those are at all not linked. In fact, it's sort of the entanglement of them that produces a specific monster that we're dealing with, I think. Just to kind of respond to what you said, I'm going to meander through a lot of the things that you guys all talked about. So I think that I wouldn't say that I have a solution to this, but I have like a proposition. But to get into that, I would say that the distinction that I would like to make is between the para and the extra. And I think what you're talking about is more aligned to sort of Clarice Ling's sort of idea of the extra state, and those are sort of the mechanism through which this appropriation is occurring. And I think that those are sort of the things that we need to be able to map out and understand in order to be able to understand the para. The para is always going across and evading, and I think it's this question of evasion. And I talked about this in terms also the idea of obscurity within sort of the context that we're kind of operating within. And it's these productions of evasion and obscurity through which that you're able to do this. And this occurs in very real-time ways as well. For example, if you're working with an institution which has a certain ideology, we would not give them everything. There would be certain things that would have other kinds of circulation and be able to produce other kinds of discourse. And I think this comes back also to what I found very interesting, sort of what both of you said in terms of complicity and disentanglement. I find the idea of disentanglement quite problematic, just because it kind of goes back to a very Judeo-Christian idea of the cleansing of the pure self that is able to act. And so it is from that perspective that we resist this idea of disentanglement, but rather looking at a more Deleuzean model of enfolding, and through that and entering what you were talking about in terms of complicity. And I think that one of the things that even generationally, I think that we're very, very aware of is that, our generation cannot think of a pure self, right? Our bodies are constantly toxified from pretty much the time we were born. So there is no point at which the embodied self ever becomes pure. So we're constantly forced to think alongside these both metaphorical and literal toxic elements that we're constantly forced to inhabit. And therefore this idea of the ultimate purity that one can reach becomes unattainable. And therefore it becomes a sort of self-defeating in a sense. And so, we have to think of another model through which to encircle and to act alongside, to pull into another framework.
If I can just quickly respond to that. I suppose this entanglement or not participating in discourses of complicity is not to start anew. It's recognizing the space that you inhabit or to you act and speak within is already perhaps a designated negative space. For example, as Chinese, as someone who lived through some sort of negative associations coming from a nation state, and in your daily experiences, there is this negativity that is associated in terms of imageries and social identities that is completely constitutive. And I don't have to, I think, or collectively, no one has to participate in a negative space in a way that it needs to be set as an enemy. But dwelling in that negative space is to also understand there are emotions and senses that's very much providing access towards what's attached on these emotions. And that's, I think, what maybe artistic practice is able to activate. This sort of abstraction and the sort of formation of abstraction, how it comes into being. And yes, it's multifold, and yes, it is borrowing a lot of alterations in terms of alternatives, and yeah.
Because thank you for the provocation. But I do think that it's never black and white. Yeah. So and human ego never allows it also, because it keeps coming back as something to be healed over and over again. So I don't think this is a process that can be finalized in any case. But what we reach is a sort of an undefined place that can threaten a lot of people. Because it is like those binaries and oppositions that we actually all depending on, even when we are in the theoretical space. So getting rid of them, or attempting to get rid of them, and to reach this ground of a space of opacity, let's say, is not an easy task. And maybe just to follow up on disentanglement as only a Judeo-Christian notion, I do think that there is, as I was trying to explain in my presentation, that there is still so many shamanistic practices inside what is called monotheist Islamist belief of people. And they are even following that in a very, a kind of a natural way, even not thinking that it's a sort of a shamanistic space. It's just a very natural kind of a follow-up and a transformation. So in a way, also, these spaces also exist in monotheist religions, and disentanglement as such is also not a kind of pure cleansing. I think in generally, when all these, let's say, power structures and all these regimes are recreating their own mythologies through using these discourses from their own perspective, I think it's also very important to see the gaps and pockets that kind of really very differ, and that makes actually things much more diversified and differentiated than it looks in the first look and from the first case.
I want to say a little bit about practice and history of feminism, or different types of feminism. I think we usually don't talk about institutionalized feminism, for instance, in China. But of course, the equality and women's rights were not granted because women participated in revolution, in construction of the nation and social production. So that's why in the 50s and in the 60s, not only strong women on screen as major protagonists along Sir Sister Liu, but also Li Shuangzhuang and other famous women figures. They're still kind of memorized by older generation of Chinese women, and their behaviors, their heroic manners, or their confidence and dignity were really inspiring for many Chinese women, and their activities emulated by the female population. So there was a slogan called "Women can hold up half of the sky," and I think it's said by Mao Zedong. I don't remember. Yeah, but it's a kind of official slogan. And even in Women's March in Germany and in the U.S. in the past few years, this slogan is still being held. So I think this. I know some scholars like Wang Lingjun in the U.S. She has been doing research, and she's going to publish a book on this. Of course, this kind of partly already becomes history, because nowadays both the official discourse and the popular culture present women in this kind of a rampant capitalist situation and in individualism. Present women as kind of eroticized, infantile, and objectified. So both such characters in popular culture, TV dramas, film, but also in the atmosphere, the patriarchal atmosphere behind the screen, in film industry, in art circle in China. I think it's a global thing in Hollywood as well. So I don't mean to idealize the socialist period, but I think if there's anything we can learn from the historical experience by sticking together, the solidarity. Yeah, we don't divide into different groups by overtly played identity politics. Yeah, of course, identity politics is important, but it doesn't. It shouldn't dominate every conversation. And I think all groups should be united to fight for a better future.
Okay, we have just started with one question, and we already have a lot of. So please, more questions from the from the audience. Okay, please use the mic.
So thank you all for your very stimulating talks. Sort of got lots of things in my mind, and they're not really cohering into anything too solid right now. But I'm curious about, the fact that you're all sort of either practicing or talking about practices of resistance, anarchy, and there's a sort of especially in your paper, Abhijan, negativity or a resistance against the idea of institutions. And yet you have started an institution. Yeah. So what I'm curious about is how do you negotiate that? And what are the ethics of organization in the space of activist work?
Does anyone else want to? No. Okay, no. No, that's actually a very good point that you made right there. But I do want to be, again, a distinction needs to be made. I am not against institutions as such. It's sort of a more. Sorry. I feel like I'm really loud already if I bring them like. Huh? So I want to make this distinction quite clear that I'm not against institutions as such. It's more about re-engineering the institutions that we have. And so I would say that, again, the forest curriculum exists as both an institution, as nothing, as an artist collective. So it's sort of always finding these ways of evading capture. And that's kind of what we're trying to understand. So when we're trying to think about an institutional model, we're really learning from sort of the real denizens of Zomia, whether it's like people in the Shan state, whether it's like, like Laotian currency traders across the border, and sort of that kind of practice that we're trying to tap into and use it to navigate already existing institutional landscapes. I wouldn't say that I'm against institutions as such, right? But I would really, because all of you guys are talking about activism in different ways, and I think that thinking about organization and activism is something that we should all kind of weigh in on.
Well, I would say like kind of a bit curatorially for me it functions differently because through my work I decided like to work through institutions but never work in the institutions. So that was a kind of let's say a resistant practice maybe, like also to learn what curatorially needs to be learned from these institutions and carry them along to different periphery locations. This is something that I did also personally when after working in Documenta, then I took the artistic direction of a festival in Sofia, where I actually took a lot of the things that I learned in this periphery space where the institutional structure does not exist. And I would say, like similarly, right now, I'm working also for a new foundation, let's say, or in the framework of a guest program of a new foundation in Amman, and also like a place where it's not easy to like kind of get a structure, professionalized structure we know as such, which is very challenging and very, very refreshing at the same time. That I find that I find quite important, again, like to again building, learning from the institution, learning from education of a team, that, you know, that's kind of comes back as what you need to actually be aware of in building a new team, who is not necessarily like professionalized and expert, like becoming an expertise in contemporary art. I do believe in this position of redefining, that and I'm also very inspired by certain artistic practices, also with like kind of Nili Alter, redefining herself over and over again and never actually giving up to the category that is given to her by the systems that she's working in. And that similarly, like in this last project that I've been working on Jean Genet, is also a character, a writer also who refused those sort of structures all his life. So I think this is a sort of a question of methodology in the end. Yeah.
I really like this idea of carrying across that you just talked about here.
Okay, can I quickly add on, because a few of us work in academic institutions in North America and Hong Kong, and especially in the US, I think scholars within the academia are quite separated from the society. So there's, I don't know what do you feel, but I've been trying to break the boundary between academia and the public. I think mainly by our knowledge, because after all we are educators. We teach students, but also we reach beyond the campus to the society to give public talks, to write popular articles to be read by the public. I think raise the people's social consciousness and awareness is very important. Yeah, so I've been practicing this, and also in online community. I've been building an online community, especially in China. So we have a small organization criticizing the patriarchal system right now, the practice in China, and we're trying to empower more young women to stand up against this all kinds of misogynist practice and representation, and also trying to get in touch with workers in China. Yeah, there's a small village outside Beijing, and there's some worker poets and writers, and yeah, so they have a group, but of course they are also considered the elite group among workers. Yeah, so it's always complicated to negotiate all kinds of hierarchies. Yeah, but just like you said, trying to be humble and modest when we try to understand the public or the workers more. Thank you.
I feel like I've been talking too much. But I think I wanted to make one point about what you're talking about in terms of communities. And you were saying that, we're talking to a factory collective outside of Beijing, and we're talking to so-called the elite. But I feel like a lot of the time we take this onus way too much on ourselves as well, that because we tend to have this kind of, we tend to imagine a kind of one-to-one relationship with communities, which kind of flattens out hierarchies, et cetera, within those communities. And we try to, we feel this urge to have to represent the most marginalized, and therefore we have to speak to them directly. But rather than thinking about choreographies through which this can have multiple lives and have multiple ways of dissemination and circulation, I think that's a much more productive way of going about it, because otherwise what you're trying to do is really either preaching to the converted, or you're like beating your head up against the wall for no particularly good reason a lot of the time. Curatorially.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
I think that, I mean, the thing that I'm struggling with, and it's something that we all do in terms of wanting to find these histories and of oppressed groups, and to sort of speak about what these disappeared voices are saying in our work. I'm a little uncomfortable with it, to be honest. And I think that what you said just now really touched a nerve, just like, are you just trying to find the most oppressed peoples to sort of bring those stories to light? I mean, that's not what we should, I mean, there's an ethics of action that some Inuit scholars in Canada have come up with, whereby when they work with Inuit communities, rather than going to those communities and sort of trying to extract knowledge and extract cultural capital from them, you know, first of all, there's an ethics of, you know, working as an Inuit scholar, so, which is obviously something I cannot do, but you know, making space for Indigenous scholars in the academy, but also when you go to those communities, even if you are from them, you ask what it is that they need and what it is that they want, rather than going with your own questions. And I think that one of you were talking about the methodologies of this kind of institutional research, this kind of, I mean, we are speaking from positions of power, and that's actually something that I also think is very important to remember, that, you know, even though we're always talking about marginalized narratives, we do have power, and we have to recognize what that is. So I don't know what I'm saying here, but just that we need to...
I think that there's sort of curatorial hubris, which is in thinking that the situation you're producing is a totality of the relations that can occur, rather than imagining something that can exist outside of it. And I think that's, it's sort of these ripple effects that, like, for example, this, right? You wouldn't go into an Inuit community and, like, try to extract things from them, rather than try to... They do, but you, yeah. But we'd rather not.
Yeah, but I have to say, I think everybody knows this. There's another slogan in the 50s and 60s, is that intellectuals are both the teachers and the students of the masses. Yeah, so they have to go to the factories. They had to go to the factories and the field to work with the peasants and workers. Just like Mia said yesterday, the artists, in order to depict these workers and peasants, they had to work with this, this working people and to learn from them. Yeah, this also reflected in other socialist films, but
being an embedded anthropologist.
Of course, it's different.
Yeah.
I think anthropologists. You have been an anthropologist, onlookers, and try. Yeah, so there's kind of done. Mm-hmm. I think participate in production, social production. I think that, because the discourse is to have class to replace all other differences, gender and ethnicity. But I have to think more, about this socialist culture and practice. I think it did work for some while. And I think we need to pick up this heritage.
Okay, I think we are really overrunning, but if there's one more, yeah.
A comment that I want to add, like, if you don't mind, because I do think that you know, escaping from power is not the point. You know, power is there, and it's very important to claim it and to use it. It's important what the power is used for and against, and vice versa. And I think in terms of, let's say, again, a curatorial position, one of the answers that I have from myself is like the critical presence and the long-term presence. And generally, when you look at like the kind of working conditions of curators, most of them have to hop from project to project and like claim to be in different places all at the same time, and it's not possible. So, and then when we see is like then, you know, there are certain terminologies are being quoted and used and a lot of names drop, but at the same time, like the community work is lacking. So, I think this is a kind of a very important, let's say, sacrifice from being in multiple places all at the same time. I'm telling the truth that actually it's more important to be in maybe a few number of places, trying to be in 10 places all at the same time as a curator to really speak about the thing that you are speaking, like, and also with the people surrounding us. And I do believe, like, whenever I had the chance to do that, because also there's an economy of curatorial work that you are forced to do these things. This is also important to highlight. It is like, it is incredibly nourishing. And it's also confrontational, because there's long-term conversations are also like kind of take you out of that polished space of power. So, yeah. I mean, it's a challenge to take, and not, I think more and more actually young generation curators are willing to take this over, but this is what I'm saying is especially belonging to the first generation of power curators. Which I would like to highlight.
Are you guys watching?
Okay, maybe one very last question before we call it a day.
It might be a very huge question, but it can also be a quite small one. Since I'm the last one, so I will take the luxury of expanding it a little bit. So, to go back to what Panlu was saying in the beginning of these concepts, one I think unifying characteristic of ghost or unheimlich and so on is their ambiguity. They are so ambiguous in the sense that sometimes they are monster to be hated, right? Like the Japanese 日本鬼子, right? The Japanese ghost. Sometimes they are kind of queer figure that is desirable, Diva, kind of. These ambiguities can kind of take us to various concepts in post-colonial conceptualization, queer theory, so on and so forth, of opacity, no future, so on, negativity, and so forth. What I want to bring all these to is, in terms of curatorial practice, we're all kind of related to the visual. And the visual is a very, very strong enlightenment controlling this kind of force compared to other kind of senses, dance, music, the sonic, and so on. How do practitioners, curators, artists, negotiate with this very thing of the presence, of the activation, of the activist? All these concepts are all on the side of the enlightened, of the light, of the bright, of the visible, right? So how do we use that power, or not? So how do we negotiate with that ambiguity?
Okay, I will just like answer to what Ming actually casted here in relation to the institutionalizations of the knowledges, and in relation to your questions of the curatorial methodologies as well. I really wanted to talk about these issues because I have been taught in one of the most prestigious and expensive universities in the US, in Ivy Leagues in NYU. And I believe that I'm slowly trying to de-institutionalizing myself. And these are the reason why I'm turning back to the positionality of curator, coming back to Asia and trying to digging into the archives and trying to unearthing the voices of that has been never been excavated before. And I try not to romanticize anything in related to these specific subjectivities, but trying to unearthing these voices, unearthing these has never been written historiography in relation to the specific, in lingering to the specific historicity in each Asian context is very, very important methodology, not only for the researcher, but also to the creator who is heavily influenced by this kind of like the heavy, thick artistic research process. And I believe as interlocutors in between scholars and curator, I think that it is more important to open up the knowledges to the publics in relation to more kind of approachable way of thinking. So which is museums, which is gallery, rather than in the institutionalized topos, such as the universities and so forth. Because I believe that to giving lectures in a kind of introduction courses or writing an anthology of some specific methodology in relation to the area studies is less powerful than opening up a huge exhibitions in relation to that topics. And these curatorial methodologies in relation to various researchers and archivists and so forth, and interlocating in between the audiences, students, and this active kind of process of cross-fertilization to each other is very much fertile to reproducing and invigorating the system of knowledges that we trying to deconstructualize. So yeah, that's something that I want to say because I have always kind of feeling of guilty whenever I teaching in expensive universities in the U.S. Why am I teaching this? Yes, whatever phrase that I wanted to use, but yes, I still believe in the pedagogy of the public teachings and knowledges. Yes, yes, please. And other, yes.
Okay. I guess from an artistic practice point of view, I would say I'm very careful not to assume what I am, what I'm doing, what works are made, through whom, what kind of relationality does it involve in making things, and really careful to assume what kind of effect there will be, and to be careful of assuming does not mean I am not affirmative to possibilities or potentials. I am open to one day, every one of us recognize that most Chinese people who are sitting here maybe are not Han, actually. And that might seem like a very nouveau, liberal, liberating idea to recognize. And then some crazy company decide to take samples of Tibetan, Wa, Bai's DNA and decide to tell us, actually, yeah, of course. So what? So I'm open to that as well in terms of something happening. And then you're like, oh, all the effort you put into fighting this oppression or this recognition becomes something that's so dissolvable. So when I don't assume, I claim power, and I try not to create alternative oppressive structures while claiming this power, and that's the best I can do because I'm doing it collectively, and I think I am. With yes, with my ghost, and also with it's polyphonic, yes.
I also want to add, when we talk about institutions, what kind of institutions we're talking about? Are universities the only institutions? How about corporates, galleries, museums? They're all institutions, and we don't need to deny all institutions because we have to rely on the institutions to do the work we want to share with other people. And even in universities in the US, there are public universities and private elitist universities running like big corporates. But public universities, there's so many students from underprivileged backgrounds, first generation college students with a lot of debt. Yeah, so I feel as teachers, as such public institutions, we have a kind of public responsibility to give these students a good education.
I think I know the whole questions about the exhibitionary complex, but I do still believe that exhibition as a model, as a space of multiple feelings, is still a very important way to hijack vision. But it really depends on what kind of complexity that we are able to generate, the curator is happy to generate with the help, also in the close cooperation, of course, with the artists. And then the easiest thing is like to put a few things on the wall and to pass by, and actually like create a sort of, you know, lingo, or like a kind of a meta discourse that people cannot understand, and people feel that contemporary art is all about like elitism and like this kind of weird language that nobody understands. And also when I think exhibitions also are not like created as such to open up to different languages and different feelings, people feel excluded. And for again, this is a very personal kind of position, but I say like in terms of those institutions that we find, like exhibitions, like for example, Documenta situation that happened very recently in Germany. Now we really see that we are not able to actually protect our own institutions in the face of attack of like the right wing, because at the moment right wing all comes, this is our tax money, you are using people's money, and what are you doing with it? And like in the face of this attack, then I really realized, like as the art community in Germany, we were not able to produce a very productive defense for this anti-discourse. And it still keeps on coming on. You know, it won't be only this. It will be a lot of institutions that will be like these right-wing populists will be attacking over and over again. And what do we say? And there are many ways of like doing it. So of course we cannot save the world from all of its darkness and depth, but there are things that we can create in our own spaces to make people feel that they are part of it and they can own it. So this is a responsibility, I would say, like from our side, as much as like to be good educators that you're talking about, as a kind of the good praises, because this is like a kind of a space of communication that we need to really take care in the first place. And this is a responsibility, I think, for the society, yeah, in general.
I think this is a good note to end on.
Yeah, we're really over time. Maybe we just say something to. It's both a closing remark, but also a comment. When Nikita and I received abstracts from your guys 2 months ago, a month ago, and really didn't know how, this event will come together, because it seems very fragmented. And as time goes by, and we try to put you guys into different panels, and today, it's like 2 really amazing days that we started from some of the historical case studies and looking at this transnational doers and artists and storytellers from early 20th century, and unpacking the concept of East and West, and modernism and cosmopolitanism, internationalism, and then we migrate today. We ended with a very poetic, open, porous presentation of Shen Xin, and then we have all this conversation about ghosts and etc. But I just want to say that ghosts, they're not just there, but we need to invite them. We need to create situation that bring them back to us. And that takes action, that takes curatorial action, and that takes action from artists or writers or historians. So, and this symposium is not, it has a context. So it's in tandem with the exhibition at Times Art Center. The exhibition, neither black, red, yellow nor women, which is curated by Nikita and Xiaoyu, and Shen Xin and I are also participating artists. So this is a promotion, but it's also not a promotion. I have a point. So at the opening, the first time I went to see the show, and I did feel a ghostly haunting. All these artworks, they are breathing, but they also have a dialogue with each other through spatial rhetorics. And this is the power of curating. A curator activate and bring together all these works and activate them through kind of a spatial language that is not just a vision, but also whether or not it's a space or kind of breathing or emotion or lighting, you know. So I think the curator set up a situation to invite the ghost back to us. And I think it's important for us to reflect on our own practices to think how do we create a situation. One anecdote is, I'm an art historian, I'm not a artist, but I have a piece in the show, and this is based on Nikita and I's research on a Chinese woman modernist artist active in the 30s and 40s. And this is 3 years ago when we went to this dusty state museum in very remote city in China to see her work. And at that moment, I always think I have been just art historian, and she is the object of my study. And we were sitting in this boardroom and staring at this whiteboard and waiting her work being brought to us. And that moment is like we participated in a ritual, calling her spirit coming to us. And then we waited, and the elevator opened, and they roll out her self-portrait in a kind of a cart. And that moment, it was so strong for us because we felt she is there. And this kind of a goosebump moment that you cannot necessarily put into art history paper in a peer review journal, right? And so that kind of moment is a threshold moment that launching me from an art historian to artist, whatever, whoever, kind of activating her ghostly voice. And the reason that I feel the power of that ghostly voice is that voice make think about me, my position as independent, curator, woman, and mother of three, and self-institutionalizing myself in very controlled society, So, and it's about a ghost, it's about, historical studies, but it's very much about us, situated in today. So I think it's a very tremendous learning experience for me, and I think for all of you to reflect on our practices as historians or artists and curators, but also a border-crossing storytellers. So how do we make that situation and invite the ghost back to us?
Good. Well, thank you.